My pleasure today to join you all, and also my absolute pleasure this afternoon to introduce you to our three panellists. That's Felicia Willow, who is Interim CEO of the Fawcett Society, Denise Fowler, who is the Chief Executive of Women's Pioneer Housing, and Nadia Whittam, who is the Labour MP for Nottingham East. So welcome to all of our panellists. As Kathy said, we're celebrating the centenary of the 6 Point Group. So today we've invited our panellists to talk about their experiences of feminist campaigning inside and outside of Parliament, Westminster, but with particular emphasis on how COVID-19 is impacting on women currently. Just to let you know how this afternoon will run, I'm going to invite each of our guest speakers in turn to share their views and perspectives, and then we'll have time, hopefully at the end, for you all, our audience, to pose any questions you may have. So please pop those, as Kathy mentioned, in the chat in the meantime. So let's begin. I'd like firstly to introduce you to Felicia Willow, who, as I've already mentioned, is the interim CEO of the Fawcett Society, the UK's leading membership charity campaigning for gender equality and women's rights at home, at work and in public life. Felicia is a human rights lawyer with extensive experience in leadership and also specialises in managing change, transition and crisis. Welcome, Felicia.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Well, 100 years ago, the 6 Point Group outlined its campaign aims, which were to provide better protection for children against domestic abuse, better support for single mums and bereaved mothers, and give women equal guardianship of their children, and of course to have equal rights and pay in the workplace. All of those issues, it can be argued, are extremely relevant still today. In fact, last summer, I understand, Felicia, that in the midst of the corona pandemic, the Fawcett Society launched its Make Women Visible campaign. Can you tell us a little more about that? What were its aims and what were the drivers behind it?
Sure. It was really at the very beginning of the pandemic. I think there was a sense that unfortunately has come to be realized that women were not being specifically considered in what was being done in response to the pandemic. So as early as February and March, we started doing research into what was actually happening with the way the pandemic was unfolding, how was the policy responses impacting women specifically, and really trying to get that data that no one else at the time was really looking for. I say no one else, we were working with some of our partners at places like Women's Budget Group and other organizations, but more broadly, we were really trying to make sure that women were visible and we knew what was happening. And since that time, we've done a series of different pollings throughout the year, asking about things like what's happening with homeschooling, what happens when schools shut down, what's happening at work, what's happening with furlough, and what's happening with mental health. And I think what we've seen time and time again throughout all of this is that the impact of the pandemic policy response on women has been disproportionately high. Interestingly, just last week, the Women's and Equality Select Committee came out with a report. If you haven't read it, it's definitely worth reading. And it was vindicating to read, even though it's really quite sad reading, because it was very much what Fawcett has been saying all along, that these things haven't been considered with the way that they're falling out on women. And I think that when we talk about how far have we come in 100 years, if you asked that like a year ago, we could probably have been a lot more positive. What we've actually seen over this past year is some really, really worrying backslides. What we've seen happen is, before the pandemic, we saw, 3 in 4 women who were mothers were at work. And that was something that the government has been really pushing on for a long time. It's good for the economy, etc. But of course, as soon as things like homeschooling happened, or isolation, or caring for older relatives, or people with disabilities, we saw that women were the ones bearing the brunt of that. So very early on, we saw women were losing 2 hours more than fathers were with caring for children, and taking on extra time with the caring responsibilities. We saw that women were, at the very beginning, men were furloughed more, but really since the first couple of months, it's been women who've been furloughed more than men, and more women remain on furlough now. We've seen more women lose hours at their jobs. We've seen more women working in the sectors that have really been hard hit by the pandemic. So we know that more women are essential workers, more women are in care work, and more women are in areas such as retail and hospitality that have suffered the worst really from lockdowns over the period. And at the same time, things like manufacturing and trading, and also construction, which has had a big investment from the government in this period, where you see more men working, they've done a lot better. So there's really just stage after stage, we're seeing these impacts on women that are happening. And so throughout this time, we've been trying to really raise that awareness that, women are backsliding. This is happening in the homes, in the workplaces, in society, that we're seeing this real loss of progress. And, we said, I think it was about October last year, we did a crisis at crossroads report, which was really looking at, there are some really good things happening. We're seeing flexible working for a lot of people. We're seeing people able to work from home. We're seeing part-time work that can be a lot higher paid and more senior than people previously thought could be done part-time. But we're at this junction about which way is it going to go? Are we going to lose all the women for the workplace? Are we going to have all these slides back, and that's going to take us years to gain? Or are we going to learn from what we've seen over the past year and really build back better? And I think that's really where we're pushing for. Women need to be considered in this response.
And also to have a voice. I understand that it's an arm of the campaign as well.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things Fawcett says all the time is that we need women in the room. We haven't seen women in the room with this pandemic policy response. If you think about who you see on television, it's Matt Hancock, it's Rishi Sunak, it's Boris Johnson, it's the chief medical officer, it's the chief scientific officer. And when you look at the SAGE advisory group, only 14 of the 50 are women. And you think women make up more than half the population. We need more women in the room. And I think that's a natural thing that happens, that if you don't have women in the room, you're not having those perspectives covered, and therefore you end up with a pandemic policy response that not only doesn't consider women, but actually actively disadvantages them and advantages men.
So as your findings, as you indicated, those issues facing women generally anyway have been exacerbated by the pandemic, but disproportionately affecting women, but also disproportionately affecting the women already vulnerable and disadvantaged in society. I'm thinking members of ethnic minority groups, women with disabilities, women in low paid work as well. That also was included in your report, I understand?
Absolutely. All of those factors have been additional. We've seen things like disabled women worrying about not being able to feed their children really early on, at much higher rates than women who aren't living with disabilities. We've seen Black and ethnic minority women we did some polling in Greater Manchester and the West Midlands in about July last year, and things like the use of payday loan companies and those kind of things were really high. The use of food banks were a lot higher with those groups as well. The impacts on those groups have been worse. And in our recent polling, we found that mothers on low incomes were 8 times more likely to have lost their jobs due to school closures. That kind of thing is really worrying when you start bringing in the intersectional impacts of different disadvantages or different characteristics. The picture just gets so much worse.
Yeah, so we're praying for those schools to open on the 8th of May, 8th of March at least. Yeah. So what do you believe? I mean, these are very significant societal problems. What do you believe in the short term can be done to start addressing some of these issues?
I think one of the first things I'd really like to see is the enforcement of gender pay gap reporting coming back in. That was suspended last year because the government was concerned about the burden on business. I think now we've had a year of pretty much proving that the impact is really on women that we need to worry about. And that was one way we were keeping track of it. So it seems like kind of fairly innocuous thing, but actually it's really important. It's part of the signal that women are being considered and this focus is there. So that's something we'd like to see. I think, the issue about representation, we do a lot of work. We have an Equal Power project. We're really trying to encourage women to get involved in politics and to be there in the room. Obviously, that's slightly longer term. But in the short term, the Women and Equality Select Committee report has got a whole load of recommendations that we would really urge the government to implement. So we actually wrote to Boris Johnson. Was it earlier this week? It's been one of those weeks. I can't remember how much time has passed, but quite recently, maybe it was last week. It was signed by a number of other organisations in the equality sector, really urging him to commit the government to implementing these recommendations, because what we're seeing is not a lot of action around it, if any. We'd also like to see, I think another big factor is around childcare. One of the things that, I don't like to admit that childcare is about women in work. I have 2 children. I think I pay for childcare because my husband and I work, not because I work. But what we've seen in the pandemic is when childcare goes, it's women picking up the bigger brunt of the responsibilities at home, on average across the country. So that issue is a really big one. The childcare sector is on a knife's edge and has been even before the pandemic. It's underfunded. You look at things like the free hours, and if you talk to any person who runs a nursery, excuse me, they were always saying the free hours weren't enough to cover their costs. We've now had a year where they've lost millions and millions of pounds. How we are going to get women back in work if childcare sector organisations are folding. The demand will be rising, but the spaces won't be there, and that is something that is actually a much bigger threat than I think I'd ever like to admit to myself before. But it's one of the things where we've seen, this impact on women. We need childcare. We need childcare to be supported as a necessary economic infrastructure. We all need it. It's good for the economy to have good childcare, but we're just not seeing that focus happen yet.
And another net consequence of that gender pay gap, because if it's always the second earner, isn't it, that has to give up the work if the childcare isn't available to them.
Absolutely.
So those are some short-term actions. In the long term, are there fixes that you would push for?
Oh, so many. I mean, the thing about the 50-50 thing is really, really important. I think what we'd also like to see is, we've done some work on things like gender stereotypes. Towards the end of last year, we released a report on gender stereotypes, and it was looking at children aged 0 to 7. And I think one of the things that really came out of that is, the impact of the disproportionate approach to leave that we have. In this country, we might have shared parental leave, but men aren't taking it up. Something like 2% of fathers take up shared parental leave. When you look at other countries where they've got more of an equal approach to parental leave, so you have your maternity leave period, and then you both have a period of parental leave that either you take it or you don't get it. Some of those issues around gender stereotypes, around equality in the home, around equality at work, they all start kind of falling into place, because inequality at the moment really happens. And I mean, this is kind of research based, but I can speak from the heart and say it happened to me as well. When I had my children, that's the day that my husband and I kind of started off on a different work path. There's the motherhood penalty is real. It does start there. You start making decisions. Who's going to be, if you're going to be on maternity leave, then who goes back part-time? Well, they've had a year or so, their salaries are going up. They get more opportunities because they're not kind of being asked questions about children, which I have been asked in many an interview. All these things happen, and that gap widens. And then, so of course, when these things happen, who stays home? Who looks after the old, ill parent? Who looks after the child who's homeschooling? The person on the low income? It's a vicious cycle, and that's why it really has to start with things like shared parental leave. So we'd really like to see some work done around that, and really encouraging, employers encouraging their dads to take the leave, and also, the government considering implementing this take it or leave it kind of approach to leave.
In essence, it's about attitudes, and it's incredible to think that 100 years on, we're still talking about changing attitudes. But if we don't, Felicia, what do you think the world will look like if we don't get this right?
It really frightens me, to be honest. We are seeing this slip back. We're seeing kind of this idea that women, again, are kind of fitting their work around other obligations, how they'll get back to work if childcare is not available. Are women going to be more made redundant because they were on furlough more? So when businesses fail, if the economy continues to be challenging, then are they going to be the ones who take the heavy redundancy brunt? Are they ever going to be able to make back that time? It feels like we're going to slip back decades, and how we recover from that will be really hard. And of course, that does have an impact on us as a country as well, as an economy. So, we've got a lot of other challenges going on with the pandemic and with Brexit and all these other things happening. But on top of it, if we lose our female workforce and that they're not able to get back easily, it could take years and years to fix. I mean, if you look at the gender pay gap, for example, that is closing very, very slowly. It is a very slow process. I would like to see these things moving much faster. And so I think what's disturbing is it's been so many years of slow progress, and we've had a sudden rush backwards. And it's why we need the pay gap reporting now, because we need to know what has actually happened in terms of gender pay gap. Of course, if women are out of the workforce, it kind of takes them off the books in a way, but it's it's a real issue, and it is one way of measuring what's happening to women. I'd also like to see employers reporting on who they're making redundant. If they get to that point, that those things should be transparent as well. I think a lot of employers may not start thinking about gender. If they've given furlough to certain people based on childcare, maybe they don't think about that as being an unequal gender thing to then focus on those people for redundancies. But that should be something that they are thinking about and engaging with really thoughtfully.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your thoughts.
Thanks.
I'm sure the audience will have questions for you later. So next, I'd like to introduce Denise Fowler, who is CEO of Women's Pioneer Housing, which is London's largest specialist housing association for women, which also celebrated its centenary last year, having been founded by suffragists, and also it has close links to Time and Tide magazine. So Denise has a background in law, heading in the past no less than 3 legal government departments and was also the Housing Ombudsman for England. She describes herself as a voice for women's housing. So welcome, Denise.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Yes, I mean, I've been Chief Executive of Women's Pioneer Housing now since June 2017, and I thought I knew a lot around feminism, and I thought I knew a lot around housing, and the last 3 years have been a continuing journey of discovery, talking to women and thinking about the impact that housing has on women's equality.
It was politically a very hot potato 100 years ago. Still considerably an important issue today. Fast forward to 2021, how far have we progressed?
Not as far as we might have thought. So looking into our history, we were, as I said, set up by suffragettes and suffragists and housing campaigners who, in the aftermath of the First World War, realised that there were a lot of women who were having to make their own way in the world, and there was no provision for housing for them at all. So the first anti-discrimination legislation came in 1919, which allowed women to enter professions such as becoming lawyers or accountants or doctors. But in order to be able to pursue those professions, they needed to have somewhere safe and secure and affordable to live. And Ethelred Browning, who was an Anglo-Irish suffragist who was the founding force, really, of Women's Pioneer, relayed stories of trudging around trying to find accommodation and getting nowhere, and everyone saying, oh, no, you know, I'd much prefer, we've got to house our heroes, and completely forgetting that women had any kind of specific needs to live independently at all. And she got together a group of other leading suffragettes and suffragists, including Helen Archdale, who was the editor of Time and Tide and the partner of Lady Rhonda. So very clear links. And these were women who had, you know, very strong ideas, and they understood that a home of her own was essential to women's equality. And so they made the case for establishing a housing association, and they went and got other people involved, and people bought shares in the organisation. And over time, they bought these amazing properties in what's now Notting Hill. And then they used one of the first female architects, Gertrude Leverkus, to convert a lot of the flats into one-beds and studio apartments for women of modest means. And 100 years from then, we're still doing the same thing, really. We're still housing women who simply cannot afford to live in London. And in order to make the case for that and to show why it's important, we've done some research with the Women's Housing Forum, the Women's Budget Group. We've pulled together other research, such as that done by the Fawcett Society, to look at how the gender pay gap translates into an affordability, a housing affordability gap. Maybe the most shocking thing that I found was that the gender pay gap, of course, looks at the hourly rate of pay, but it doesn't take into account the fact that women are more likely to work part-time, more likely to be in insecure accommodation and insecure employment. And so when you look at the overall salary gap, at the time we did it in 2018, it was 34%. Women on average earn 34% less than men. And it's only moved in those 3 years to 31%. But women on average earn a third less than men. So when you then map that against average rents in every region in England, taking the usual criteria of would you have to spend more than 30% of your income in order to get a flat, we found that there isn't a single region in England where a woman on an average woman's salary can afford to rent a home of her own, let alone to buy one. Whereas when we looked at a man's average salary and then mapped that against each of the regions, a man on an average male salary can afford to rent in every single region except London, and in London it's not as unaffordable for men as it is for women. So it's not surprising that so many women rely on social housing. And over 20 years or so, I would say maybe more than that, I'm maybe collapsing my own age when I think about it, back from the 90s onwards, we've seen a real reduction in the amount of affordable housing that's available, social housing that's available. And women are disproportionately impacted by that. And women are more likely to be, much more likely to be statutorily homeless, living in temporary accommodation with children. Single women, as I've said, find it incredibly difficult to afford housing. And so many of them live into their 40s and 50s renting rooms in a shared house. And that's kind of okay when you're in your 20s. You can argue about the milk every morning, but still doing that in your 40s and 50s. And some women come back to doing that after divorce, because women have such a big penalty for women after divorce. So Women's Pioneer only has 1,000 properties. 50% of those the council nominate people to, a quarter go to agencies we work with, such as Solace Women's Aid, or the Iranian and Kurdish Women's Organisation, who deal with honour-based killing, or the Richmond Fellowship, who deal with women with mental health problems, or St Mungo's, who deal with homeless women. And the last quarter, we have our own very small waiting list, which opens once a year for 20 places, and we are overrun. We open it for 2 weeks, and we are overrun with applications from women in London who simply cannot afford to find a place of their own, and therefore are subject to harassment from landlords. I mean, I think this year we had a woman who came home to find her landlord lounging at his leisure, expecting, extra services from his tenant. We have people who've been harassed in their accommodation, but who over a number of years have never been able to afford to rent a home of their own. Again, another example, one of the women who lives in our sheltered scheme now, she moved in when she was 60. She'd worked full-time for 40 years in one of the top salons in London as a hairdresser, and had never earned enough to be able to rent her own home. The first front door of her own that she had was when she was 60, and she moved into our sheltered accommodation. And it's worse for some people, for some specific women. So I know the Fawcett Society are one of the few places who've actually managed to get some intersectional information about the gender pay gap. And when the hourly pay gap for the average white British woman the average woman in the UK was 18%. For Bangladeshi and Pakistani women, it was 26% per hour. And then when we look at the experiences of women with disabilities, and here again, COVID is, I won't repeat what Felicia said, but in terms of specific groups of women with disabilities have been massively disproportionately impacted by the COVID pandemic. And finding accessible accommodation is even more expensive, even more difficult, has so many more hurdles in it. And actually, there's not enough social housing which is fully accessible for disabled people as a whole.
You paint a very bleak picture. What is the long-term impact of such insecurity on women and their children?
Well, I think for the women who are in our housing, when we talk to them about it, it reduces your chances of being able to do what you want to do with your life. So if you're spending in London on average, if you're on an average woman's salary, you'd be spending about over 70% of your salary on renting a place. So you certainly couldn't go part-time and do some studying. You couldn't pursue a career. Often it makes a lot of women just financially dependent on men, or on their partners. So it's much easier to afford a property if there's two of you. If you're in a heterosexual relationship, then the man's likely to be earning more. That gives you access to more places. And as Felicia says, then when you have children, you have less chance really of being able to afford somewhere of your own. And then that has an impact in terms of women's ability to leave abusive relationships. So around domestic abuse, I don't know if people have heard the research that Sylvia Warby did, but when she was at Lancaster University, I think she's now at LSE, and she looked at experience of domestic abuse. And it's true that men and women experience domestic abuse. It's about 1/3, 2/3. But when you look at abuse from a partner over a long period of time, in her case, she looked at the ONS stats and used as a benchmark those who'd experienced 10 or more experiences, incidents of violence such that it would count as a crime in the police stats. By the time you got to 10 or more of those incidents, it was 98% women and 2% men. And
of course, the NSPCC tells us of a worrying rise in cases during lockdown. Again, the long-term impact, I guess we've only got to wait and see.
Yes, and people like Refuge and Women's Aid have seen a massive increase in the number of women contacting their workforce. And so some of those, what that means is that one of the reasons that I think and others think that difference is so stark with women remaining in those situations is financial independence. If you're economically disadvantaged, you cannot afford to leave. So it's not that both sexes might experience that, but who's in a better position to leave. And even when women do leave, the refuges are massively oversubscribed, but if you do get into one, then the chance of moving on into a secure place of your home are really difficult, because very few housing providers specifically focus housing on women coming out of those move-ons. And there's a policy issue there, in that as housing associations, we're encouraged to give as many nominations as possible to the local authority because of the pressures the local authorities are in. But single women experiencing domestic abuse, subject to what happens in the new domestic abuse bill, are not a priority for housing, and so they've been missed out. So we know from the organisations we work with that they have real problems finding move-on accommodation. And if you've left, quite a nice house, but you've left because of domestic abuse, and then you find yourself in one room for months, even years, while you're waiting for somewhere else, you put your life on hold, you're in limbo.
And that of your children, of course.
Yes, and
when there are children involved.
I mean, you're more likely to be a priority need if you've got children, but that doesn't mean that the impact of domestic abuse is any less. And we know now that it's a massive impact on the children as well as on women. And interestingly, the 6-point group clearly recognised that 100 years ago, and we're, as usual, going back and explaining things that we knew before and just keep reiterating them. But yeah, I don't want to be entirely negative. We are trying to do stuff, and I think the reason we're saying all these things is about getting housing providers and local authorities to recognise the importance of housing to tackling gender inequality, and partly that's just about building more social homes, because many women just want a home. They don't specifically want women's housing, but they just need a home, and recognising the things that bring women into needing a home. But also there is a need for some women-led housing, and that's particularly for women who've experienced trauma and any form of sort of violence against women or girls. A large proportion of those women suffer from PTSD. There's some research by the Army in America, interestingly, which says that the experience of PTSD, that women who've experienced violence, their experience is very similar to soldiers in a war zone. And it's long running, and it continues to have flashbacks. And we know from women who come and live in our homes that they can sometimes see someone else being harassed or abused, and that will trigger their PTSD. So living somewhere that feels safe and secure is really important. It's not just about bricks and mortar, it's also about the way in which you recognise the women's experiences and reflect those in the types of housing you provide.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you very much for that insight. So last but not least, before we move on to questions, let me introduce you to Nadia Whittam, who is the Labour MP for Nottingham East. Before her election in December 2019, Nadia worked as a hate crime worker and a care worker, whilst also studying for her law degree at the University of Nottingham. During her first year as an MP, and what a year it's been, she's campaigned on issues affecting students and young people, climate change, the arts and mental health. Welcome, Nadia. So you'll be aware that the 6-point group strategy was to target politicians to effect change. Now, as a member of Parliament yourself, Parliament currently made up of 1/3 women and 2/3 men. How much faith do you have in your colleagues to put women's issues and gender equality to the top of the political agenda?
Well, I think it's fair to say that Westminster is a pretty hostile place for the kind of feminist politics that I and some other MPs have. When we have a Prime Minister who called Muslim women letterboxes, MPs who are completely opposed to the rights of trans women, and of course MPs who have consistently voted to cut funding for domestic violence services, to cut funding for welfare, all of these things that have disproportionately fallen on women. The government just isn't interested in meaningfully changing that structural inequality, and their policies harm women. So I think whereas you might find that there are some Conservative MPs who perhaps want to protect the rights of women CEOs, some Conservative MPs, but probably not all of them, they're not voting in the interests of the vast majority of women. So I see one of my roles as being to platform feminists in Parliament, particularly those grassroots feminist campaigners and people from marginalised groups, because I think that the really important point to make is that change doesn't come ultimately from MPs in Parliament voting the right way. Yes, we can do an awful lot of damage and an awful lot of good as well, but looking back at history, the gains that we've made as women have come off the back of movements, very powerful movements, and women organising, from the suffragettes to the Grunwick strike to a few years ago, the women in Scotland and the GMB Union going on a women's strike at their treatment by the City Council. So looking back at what that 6-point plan was trying to achieve and where we are in Parliament currently, I think it's a really mixed bag. And in many ways, I think the clock is being rolled back on women's rights. We've only got to look at coronavirus to see that. I mean,
so what are the issues which most concern you?
Well, just looking at coronavirus in particular for a moment, I think it's important to recognise that we're experiencing this virus, which is disproportionately impacting women, and particularly the most marginalised women, against a backdrop of a decade of austerity. And during that decade, since 2010, we saw 86% of the burden of austerity falling on women. And that was especially women of colour, migrant women, young women of my age, aged between 18 to 24, who are now in swathes being laid off from their jobs, particularly in retail and hospitality and sectors that are more populated by women. And then we're seeing that women, as Felicia said, are concentrated in many of those jobs that are front-facing. So care work, the NHS, in supermarkets, in education. So in those contexts, women have been put at risk, whether it was through PPE shortages, lack of proper social distancing at work, totally inadequate statutory sick pay that meant that people simply could not afford to self-isolate. And then there's the fact that so many of those roles are underpaid, they're massively undervalued. The women in those jobs aren't being paid the real living wage by and large. And the government has had many, many years, but particularly in this last year where it's all kind of come to a head very clearly, to do something about that, but they haven't. And then I think when we look at the impact that that has on children, so in my constituency in Nottingham East, which includes Nottingham Trent University, almost half of the children in my constituency are living below the poverty line. But looking forwards, because this is just as important, and Felicia spoke a bit about this as well, we've seen that internationally women's jobs were almost twice as vulnerable during the pandemic as men's jobs. So we've got to fight to protect jobs that are often held by women, and to ensure that that the impact of the recession that follows coronavirus isn't disproportionately borne by women. Then there's Brexit, and we've got to guard against the prospect of the government using Brexit to weaken already very weak workers' rights now that we've left the EU. So I'm talking about things like maternity and paternity leave, work holiday allowances, sexual harassment regulations, anti-discrimination legislation that all has its basis in EU law. And then there's the sort of hidden side of the pandemic, the unpaid work and women's experiences in the home. So women are bearing the brunt of domestic chores and caring responsibilities. The schools are closing. Many mums, I think it's 1 in 4 of working mums are saying that they're having to pay for childcare themselves, and that's on, let's not forget, much lower wages. And then there's the risk of domestic abuse and the fact that that has risen. So for me, and it's important to remember again that that is in the context of austerity. So already every day in this country, 155 women are being turned away from refuges, and that is only going to get worse as the problem gets worse. But the funding that is put into domestic violence services, community services, etc., does not match the need and doesn't match what has already been cut.
So as we emerge from the pandemic with so much in society to rebuild and to put right, what do you think should be a priority for this government?
I think there are 6 main things I'd say. If you like a new what the 6-point plan would look like now, and unfortunately not a great deal of progress has been made since that time, although the progress that has been made has been completely on the backs of amazing women in history, and including women who are with us on the panel today. So a big thing is that the minimum wage should be the real living wage. That's a very simple thing that could be put into law tomorrow. Build Back Better vision of the government completely excludes investment in social care, which is pretty shocking given the damage that we've seen that underinvestment in social care has caused for elderly people and disabled people, but also for the disproportionately women who work in that sector. So I think the government could definitely do with a lesson in gender budgeting from the WBG. And then there's welfare. The welfare system needs to be completely overhauled, and to put the needs of women, particularly marginalised women, right at the centre. We've seen from tragic cases in Nottingham and in other parts of the country as well, but particularly close to home, the impact of an inhumane benefit system that keeps people in poverty. And as well, looking at how the benefit system can work to empower women. I think it's shocking that universal credit is still paid into a single bank account. That makes it very difficult for women who are being financially coerced or subjected to domestic violence and abuse by a partner to escape that situation. So, of course, we need, in terms of domestic violence, more funding for that and for sexual assault services. That's very, very important. And then I'd say childcare as well, absolutely. And I'm also wary of pitching this as a women's rights issue, because it should be an issue for anyone who has children, but we know that that burden disproportionately falls on women. So we need more flexible working, which partly the pandemic has shown is possible, but of course not for all women. We need free childcare. We need equality in parental leave, and for that parental leave to be paid. And then just lastly, 2 points about intersectionality that I think, and they're not exclusive. I think it's important that we talk about the rights of all women, disabled women, trans women, LGBTQ women, migrant women, women of colour, etc. But I think that 2 very important and timely points to make is that we include trans women in that fight, and that we say very clearly that there's no conflict between the rights of trans women and the rights of cisgender women, And in that fight against patriarchal violence, all of us are natural allies. And then the second point to make, because these women are severely marginalised by the government's hostile environment policy, is migrant women. Now, migrant women are excluded from the domestic abuse bill, which by and large is a good bill, but it excludes migrant women. So they face already barriers in terms of accessing healthcare, no recourse to public funds, which can have devastating impacts on them and their families. You can have women who are forced to sleep rough just because of their immigration status. And then our asylum system itself treats women very, very badly. It treats women fleeing domestic violence and sexual violence with suspicion, with hostility. Often we even see these women being deported back to their abusers. So those in, well, perhaps it wasn't that short actually, but in sort of in short, are the things that I would prioritise.
There's quite a lot there, but all very important issues. So what can you do in your role as an MP and as a woman, as a feminist, to achieve change in those areas? And also, what would you say that the rest of us can do as well?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, because the position that we're in at the moment is that the Tories have an 80-seat majority in Parliament, which means that anything that they don't want to get through, whether it's cuts to universal credit, which they're proposing, or whether it's denying children free school meals over the holidays, the power in Parliament really is in the Tories' hands. But outside of Parliament, that's a different question. And I think movements, I mean, you could take many. Free school meals, for example, was something that the government was forced to U-turn on. That was as a result of, yes, parliamentary pressure, but also grassroots pressure.
Yeah.
So I think it's important that people engage with community groups and social movements and are part of that, because MPs listen to that, and particularly if you have a Tory MP, to contact your member of Parliament and just implore them to represent you, because that is their job.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Well, I'd like now to throw the discussion open to questions from our audience. A few have come in. In the meantime, if you do want to ask any of our panelists anything, please do pop it in the chat bar. So the first question I have here in front of me is how, and if I can take each of you again in turn, how has COVID influenced your approach to campaigning? Felicia.
I mean, in some ways, COVID, the working from home remote thing has actually given us greater access to a lot of people in a strange way. We are able to talk to people directly, engage with people. We were planning a big feminist roadshow this year. Last year. It's 2021 now. So 2020, we're going to do a big feminist roadshow going around some of the cities outside London. And what we actually switched to is doing Corona conversations. So we had a series of conversations with interesting panelists. And what we found is we were able to engage a lot of people who wouldn't even have been able to come to the feminist roadshow. So there are some real positives that have come out of this remote working. I think, sometimes organizations like Fawcett can be perceived as very London centric. I don't live in London, so I'm always really keen to see what's happening outside of London, because it can be a very different world. And I think what this year has done is enabled us to do that. So there's definitely been positives. It's made some things harder. I mean, today there's an equal pay hearing, and in previous years we would, walk them to the hearing and show solidarity and encourage people to come and kind of physically show up. Instead today we've, arranged a few people to sit in on the hearing, including Carrie Gracie, who wrote the book on equal pay. So, we're still doing what we can, but sometimes some of that immediacy has gone, kind of person to person type of feeling. But I think generally, when you look at things that we do with politicians, APPGs and those kind of things, they're quite similar. If anything, we can just schedule a lot more in because we don't have to spend time traveling. So I think in terms of practicalities, there's been a lot of good things. In terms of our campaign topics, obviously COVID has taken a huge frontline with everything we're doing. We have still done other projects. We've been still campaigning on equal pay. We're still campaigning on the gender stereotypes that we did last year. We're doing some work on sexual harassment in the workplace. So there's a lot of things that are still going on. I think COVID has probably kind of covered them up a bit because it's the big issue and there is so much to say. But we really felt, I say we, I wasn't there at the time, but Fawcett really felt at the time that it was really essential work. And I think this is a moment in a generation and it was the right thing to do. So even if it has come at some costs to what we're doing, we had to be part of this and we had to be part of really getting involved early to make women visible. So good and bad.
Thank you. Denise, has it impacted on your tactic?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm not primarily a campaigner. I campaign in order to highlight issues around women and housing, but in the context of actually running an organisation which is currently housing women. So I think one thing COVID has done is given us all a new appreciation of home and how important it is. And everyone's experience of the pandemic and particularly of the lockdowns has been very different depending on the quality of their home. And, it's very different living in a house with a garden to living in either as a single person in a bedsit without contact with other people, missing your friends who are so much part of keeping you sane on a day-to-day basis. Or if you're a mother in temporary accommodation or in a refuge with children and nowhere to go with them. It has highlighted how essential a home is to everything else you want to do. Your access to health, to education, to companionship and friendship and a social life is dictated by your home. And things that are wrong with your home assume a bigger importance when you're trapped inside it for as long as many people have been. In terms of how our own Women's Pioneer, we've done over 3,000 welfare calls during the pandemic, and we've identified probably more issues than we would otherwise have done. We previously had people out and about on the patch, but I think this highlighted to us that there are people who are just sitting in their home and not realising that there are people who could support them or could help them. Particularly for older women, we've realised that some of our longest term tenants have got beginnings of dementia and maybe needed more support. We've identified hoarding issues, things like, because of the nature of our association, we have a lower level of domestic abuse than other associations, but there has been some, and we've had a real increase in other agencies who are desperate to refer women to us, and we don't have the housing. So the experience of domestic abuse during the lockdown or honour-based killing, any of those things that we're working on have been worse. And we're really conscious of that and really conscious of the need to find more, for more accommodation. I could go on forever, but I won't because I know it's really briefly.
Thank you, Denise. Nadia, I guess that in context, that question, really, what post-pandemic is the best way forward? Can we use some of these fantastic tools that we have, been available to us during the pandemic to reach out to people remotely? Will it make campaign groups, will it make our voices stronger and go further, maybe?
I think, as Denise said, COVID has really highlighted that class inequality and the scourge of low pay and undervalued work that many of us have been aware of for a long time, but it's very much in the public eye now, which makes campaigning on those things in some ways a bit easier. And I think in some ways, campaigning has been made more accessible by, so for example, there are some people who wouldn't be able to turn up to a meeting, but would be able to nip into a Zoom for half an hour. But there are also people who are digitally excluded, who it's more difficult to reach now. So for example, just during my surgeries, which isn't campaigning, it's my job as a member of parliament, but I would usually hold face-to-face surgeries, but now I'm having to do those over the phone or on Zoom if people have access needs. But that's not ideal, particularly if people are living with a partner who's abusive, or even if they don't have access to a phone. one of the things that's been made more difficult by COVID, or near impossible, has been that on the streets campaigning and direct action, which is very, very powerful and has prevented things like deportations, has forced U-turns. And I think there are many issues in the last year that we would have seen people taking to the streets in their hundreds of thousands to protest against, but that hasn't happened, which has made it a bit easier for the government to push things through that there would usually be more of a pushback against. And of course, MPs are pushing back, but in a virtual parliament without the same volume of grassroots protest and support. I mean, there is the support there, but it's not being seen and heard in the same way as it would be in normal times. It is more difficult to amplify that message, particularly during a virtual parliament. You're on mute, Gail.
Forgive me, muted myself because of the commotion behind me, the perils of working women, So just finally, one question to each of our panelists again, as we do emerge, hopefully, from the pandemic. What is the world we're likely to be going into, and what will be the first on your to-do list to try and change that? Felicia.
Oh, I don't know whether to be positive or negative here. my fear is
we've got to be realistic, but we also have got to.
Yeah, my fear is that we are not going to see the recommendations that have been made delivered, and that we are going to see a huge exodus of women from the workforce that will take years to restore. So I think, you know, the big thing for us at the moment is trying to get this gender pay gap reporting reinstated and get childcare invested, because that is at least a kind of initial step forward. Without that, you know, I do really fear what will happen. And I think, you know, when we're talking about these differences between high income and low income women, you know, we are going to see those impacts worse on low income women who are on the insecure contracts. And so I think what we'll see is an increase of inequality as well. So the difference between the haves and the have-nots will get worse. And we've already seen that over recent years. And I think that's what we're going to see more of. So, you know, we have to keep fighting, I think, is the thing, not ever give up, keep trying to get this progress, keep kind of focusing on where we've come. Everybody should join the Fawcett Society. Obviously, that would be a great thing to do immediately. But, you know, just keep on making these calls, trying to get more women in the room, you know, trying to keep pushing for change, because there's, you know, it's only going to get worse if we don't keep fighting. So I think that's the fear, you know, keep pushing on these things and hope that that something will go through and we'll be able to temper the negative consequences. And
shouting about it together.
Shout about it all the time. Hold up other women, support other women, you know, collaborate, all those kind of things that women do really well. You know, the more voices we get out there, the better. I mean, that's one of the reasons Fawcett is a membership organization. You know, we really try and support local groups getting involved, doing their own campaigns, trying to get lots of different people out there, you know, saying what needs to be said and doing what needs to be done.
Thank you. Denise?
Yeah, so I think I agree with Felicia about what kind of situation we're going to be in after lockdown, and so many women are going to be facing such a difficult time. I think my first priority is going to be supporting the residents who live in our homes and our staff, in fact. And I think, you know, I'm going to continue to make the case for how important housing is, but that links into welfare and to supporting childcare and other caring responsibilities, and to link those things together in the way that we're doing today. And I think for me, I've realised I need to be doing, given what's going on with the government at the moment, to be doing more locally with local authorities, with health authorities, with, you know, voluntary agencies, to try to see if we can make a difference locally, and then that provides something that we can show. Look, this is the difference. This is the impact it does if it's taken on.
Thank you. Finally, Nadia, briefly.
Briefly, okay. The number one thing, I think, is that there's never been a more important time to join a trade union. So I have been and will be continuing to encourage women to join a union. and putting pressure on the government to implement the recommendations of the Women and Equality Select Committee urgently and holding them to account at every term, and in doing so, amplifying the voices of women in our communities who are making the same demands.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all three of our panellists. It's been a real pleasure to listen to Felicia Willow from the Fawcett Society, Denise Fowler from Women's Pioneering Housing, and Labour MP Nadia Whittam. Thank you, all of you, for your valuable time this afternoon. And also to our audience for joining us. I'd like to pay special thanks to the LSE Library for hosting this event, and to mention that our discussion today is also linked to an exhibition, an online exhibition entitled Making Modern Women, Magazines in Interwar Britain. There's a link to that exhibition in the chat. There's also a link in the chat to a feedback survey. So if you've enjoyed today, please dig that out and fill it in. If you haven't, well, I'm joking. Of course, we want to hear from all of you. So we're very grateful if you could find time to complete that as well. So all that remains for me to say is thanks for joining us, and do enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, Gail. Thanks,
Pleasure.
everyone.
Nice to see you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.